Our first speaker today is Professor Josh Tenenbaum. Josh actually earned his PhD from MIT in 1999. He's a professor of cognitive science and computation. His work looks at the brain as a simulation engine, that's what he'll talk about today, that can perform such tasks as common sense reasoning. And this morning he titled his talk, "The Brain as a Computer." So please join me in welcoming Josh to the stage.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I made the title of my talk a question, because that's really what this is about. I'm extremely excited to talk to you all here as a fellow MIT alum. This question that we're interested in, what kind of computer is the brain, is a question that's been with us for thousands of years, literally, in some form. But it's a uniquely exciting time to be working on it, because as I'll show you, some of the oldest ideas and best ideas, we're only now being able to realize their potential, but also only now being able to realize what their limitations are, where we need some new ideas, and what those possibilities are. And I'm going to try to really give you a forward-looking perspective. It's also a unique place to be doing this research at MIT, to echo the themes that Raphael and Jim showed you, because this is uniquely both a science and an engineering project. Our goal is to understand how the mind and the brain work in engineering terms. We show that by being able to build more increasingly human-like intelligent systems. And that's both a important application of our research, but it's really also a proof that we've actually understood something in the terms that satisfy us as scientists. So let me start off with what's really the oldest version of answering this question. It's an idea that goes back literally to the beginnings of formal and recorded Western thought, say with Aristotle. The idea that intelligence is some kind of symbolic processing, something like some kind of logic. You have Boole, the inventor of Boolean logic, and maybe the most familiar versions of these ideas are when mathematicians first started to formalize thought, people like Alan Turing, Alonzo Church, John McCarthy. This is an incredibly powerful idea, which really is, what it's really about is the flexibility and generality of thought. Think about all the kinds of intelligent decisions that I had to make to get to this point in my life, right here, right now, having a conversation with you about intelligence and how the mind works. Think about what motivated Alan Turing to propose the Turing test, that the way to test whether a computer was intelligent like a human was to see if you could have a conversation with it about any topic and see if it could convince you that you were talking to another human. Well, in some sense, the ideas of symbolic logic give us the possibility of describing intelligence as some kind of formal process. They don't answer the question. We didn't solve the problem in the 1970s. It gave us the idea of AI, but it didn't actually give us AI. What was missing? Well, there's a number of things that were missing. You could say it's one thing to be able to have the rules of thought, but how do you figure out which rule to apply right now? Where do the rules come from? How do you learn them? Or how might they work in the brain? When you go and look at the brain, just as Jim said, you don't see what look like symbols. You see what look like circuits. And then another powerful idea came up to prominence starting, say, in the 1980s and through the 1990s. You might have heard of this maybe most familiarly under the term of neural networks. But really think of it as intelligence as learning, as statistics on a grand scale. A view that says data come into your mind through the senses. And you can think of intelligence as finding patterns, correlations, clusters, structures you can exploit to figure out what to do right now here. And the math of finding patterns in data can be described in equations at the level of symbols. But it can also be implemented in networks of neuron-like processing units that then actually, while there's an engineering side to this, they actually have some correspondence with the circuits in the brain. And these rules of finding patterns in data actually have something to do with the mechanisms by which synapses, the connections between neurons, change their strength in response to experience. And these were great insights in neuroscience and applied math that made this possible. And where you can really see these ideas coming to actually do work for you is in what we could call AI technologies. Technologies which we all now take for granted. They've changed our lives in small and big ways. Like, for example, face detection systems, which detect faces in your photographs or on your phone. Pedestrian detection systems, which have been in the news recently. You can buy these in some of the most high-end consumer automobiles, and soon you'll be able to buy them in anything. These systems actually, what you could say, they work to the sense of passing the lawyer test, in the sense that these are directly coupled into the brakes of your car, and they work better than you do at detecting a pedestrian and knowing when to stop the car. Think about Google. You might not have thought of it as an AI system, but the founders of AI would have been incredibly impressed by a system that could search all the world's knowledge and answer any question, or at least retrieve a relevant document for answering any question at a snap. Or maybe most familiarly, as an sort of AI technology, IBM's Watson system. I'm just curious here, how many people saw IBM's Jeopardy playing computer? Okay, pretty much everybody. IBM has a great marketing engine, but behind it there's actually really interesting technology. A system that beats the world's experts in the smart person's video game, or game show. All of these systems are impressive AI accomplishments, and they combine the idea of statistics, statistical learning from data, and symbolic processing. But none of them are truly intelligent, and we want to understand what's missing and how do we go next. To illustrate this, I'm going to again pick on another great technology, Google, to show sort of what's the gap between what you can do with statistics over symbols and real understanding. So just one remarkable thing that Google does is you can type in something like this, which notice is not exactly a sentence in English, it's got a couple of spelling errors. But Google finds those spelling errors, corrects them, and actually returns a useful answer. What does it say here? How does Google's spelling correction work? It's remarkable that it's able to find those errors and still give you something useful. Now, let's introduce a sentence with a few more spelling mistakes like this. Anyone tell me what this says? You can't read it. That's right. How about this? Right. Okay. So you can all read this. You can't read that. Google can't read either of them. Right? The difference is that the way Google does this is it finds patterns in sequences of characters and strings, and that's enough to solve simple versions of this problem, but it's not enough to solve these massive misspellings. Why can you do this? Well, it's because for you, language isn't just about patterns and symbols. It's about meaning. Words refer to concepts. Sentences refer to thoughts. And you have this amazing ability to actually understand and to find meaning in all of that data and all of those statistics on symbols. Here's another way to get at these kind of common sense challenges, which is really the work that I'm working on here, and I'll tell you a little bit about more concretely. Think about scene understanding. So you look at a scene like this, and you don't just detect what's where, the way we have face detectors or pedestrian detectors. You can detect lots of objects here, but you don't just see what's where, you see what will happen and what you can do. Think about this as a kind of intuitive physics. You look at the scene and you see what's stably supported. If you were to remove the table, what would fall, what wouldn't? If you were to bump the table, what would fall off, what wouldn't? What's attached to the back wall? What can you just pick up, what would you have to pry off? Or look at this scene here. Even if you've never built a house, you can look at this and see which of these pieces of wood are, say, more structurally important or not. Which ones could you take off without making the whole thing fall down? Which ones can you just, if you were so inclined, go pick up and walk off with? Which ones would you have to actually pry out? This thing is held together by nails, but you can't see any of the nails, yet you know which things are held together how. Or this scene here from our local cafe, which the barista described as a disaster waiting to happen. You knew if you were to go pick up that bin of dishes, you'd have to restack them. If you just were to pick it up like that, they'd almost surely all fall to the floor and shatter. This is a kind of intuitive physics. Over here we have what's a kind of intuitive psychology. You look at these people, and even though you don't know them, you get a sense of what their relationship is to each other, what they think, what they want. You'll hear a lot more about this kind of intuitive psychology from Rebecca Sachs after me. But we want to understand how a machine, the human mind, or a machine that we program in a piece of silicon hardware, can do this kind of common sense understanding. It's what we call the common sense core, this idea that human thought is structured around a basic understanding of the world in terms of physical objects, intentional agents, and their interactions. And we want to understand what's the form and content of this core knowledge, how it's used to make sense of our experience, where it comes from, how it's constructed from some combination of what's wired into you genetically and your experience. This is a computational version of the classic questions of nature versus nurture. And ultimately, how it's instantiated in the brain's hardware. In my work, I'm only just beginning to make the connections down to the actual hardware level. I'm coming more from the software level, and over the course of today, you'll see all those levels connected. But this is the direction that we're coming from. This common sense core, you can see even in the most basic forms, and a lot of our work is developmental to try to boil these phenomena down to their most essential core. So just looking at how children play with blocks, play with each other, playing with blocks, you can see all this stuff in that setting. Or maybe in its most basic form, again, in the spirit of the best science, we try to strip these phenomena down to the most minimal kinds of stimuli and tasks. So think about things like these. This is a little movie that comes from an experiment with 13-month-old infants. And I'm just going to play it, and I want you to think about what's happening here. So you could see this as a blue ball and a red ball rolling on a green plane. But what's a more interesting way to describe what's going on here? Chasing, yeah, it looks like the blue one is chasing the red one, and the red one is fleeing or trying to get away. That's a kind of intuitive psychological inference, a goal. Each one has a complementary goal in this case. There's a physics which is important to this. The chasing only makes sense because of the barriers there. If you take away the barriers, you wouldn't see it as chasing. You'd see it as some kind of weird sort of dance. And the same is true for a 13-month-old infant. And the mental states here are not just the goals, but the beliefs. It looks like the blue ball has a sort of funny false belief. He thinks he can fit through those holes, which he can't actually. Right? Or look over here. This is a much more famous video from the psychologist Hyder and Simmel in the 1940s. And I'm just going to show a brief excerpt of it. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. You could see this as two triangles and a circle moving, but again, you don't see it that way. You see it as characters in a whole story. It looks like the big one is kind of beating up, bullying the little triangle who's sort of chases him away there while the circle's hiding inside, and now the big one's going in there and kind of cue the scary music, right? Don't worry, I've stopped it at a cliffhanger moment. It ends happily, at least for two of the three characters. But you can go watch the rest of this at home. Right. So how do you get out of this, these sort of intuitive physics, these objects, the forces they exert? You see these triangles, like one is actually banging into the other, banging them up against the wall. The psychology, their beliefs and desires, even things like intuitive sociology and morality, who's on whose team, who's good or bad. This is what we want to understand. And we think if we can understand this, it's also going to be the basis of transformative new AI technologies. You can really see this most clearly in robotics, where there's been a real revolution in the last few years that hasn't reached most of you yet, but is starting to behind the scenes in manufacturing and in the next technology or the next generation of automobile technology, for example, Google's self-driving cars. And if you look at what the Google engineers understand what they can do and what they still have to figure out how to do, it's exactly this kind of common sense understanding of how people interact with each other and in the physical world. So here's a quote from some of the tech leads on Google's amazing self-driving cars. The piece that's missing is not better radars or cameras or lasers, it's really the intelligence behind them. We do a good job of detecting pedestrians at the side of the road, but we don't yet have built in the kind of intuition for what a pedestrian might do, right? That's the model of what the other person is trying to do, what they think, that we use just mostly unconsciously as we're driving around. Or for example, something they discovered the hard way. At a four-way stop intersection, we realize there's subtle communication that goes on. Once you've come to a stop, we inch forward a bit to signal, hey, we're ready to go. That's what they had to figure out after painful experience, that they had to wire that into their car. Whereas, any one of your 16-year-old sons or daughters, when they're learning to drive, you didn't have to wire that in. They just did it automatically. Again, they might have had their own slightly painful experiences, but they didn't need engineers to program that into them and realize it for them. Your brain figures that out and programs it in for itself. So we want to understand what those programs are like. And I certainly don't have the time to go into the technical details, although it's great that this audience, if I had the time, I could. But I'm happy to talk with any of you afterwards during the break or the lunch about the real technical stuff behind this. The basic idea that we work on are kinds of computer programs called probabilistic programs, in which the programs here describe the causal processes in the world, in the physical world, in the social world, that are giving rise to our experience. Things like physics simulators. If you've played, how many people have played games like Angry Birds? If you haven't, again, your kids or your grandkids are playing these games. Some of the most popular video games these days employ very fast, approximate simulations of Newtonian physics that are really fun to interact with, particularly on touchscreen devices. You're probably all familiar with graphics programs, like you see Pixar movies, but we're using sort of fast, approximate graphics programs that, again, allow you to play, for example, these 3D interactive video games. Or, for example, robotic planning algorithms. These are programs that roboticists have come up to get robots to have models of the world and goals to figure out how to plan effective actions. And we think you can use all these same kinds of programs, but in a probabilistic setting where you're able to sort of make guesses about what might happen in the future when you're not sure, or in a curious sort of way run them backwards to make guesses about what their inputs were from the observed outputs. So for example, if you want to understand this image, you might see the output of a graphics program and make some guess about what kinds of things in the world gave rise to that image through graphics, and then make some guess by running a kind of approximate physics simulation forward to see what's going to happen. This is this sense that we're modeling the brain as a simulation engine. Or we might say, for example, make guesses about intuitive psychology by observing your actions and saying, well, what were the beliefs and desires that you would input to a planning algorithm that might explain those observed actions? So just to give you a sense in the few minutes left of how we actually use these to study the mind, we do experiments with human behavior that we then try to capture quantitatively with these models. So we might show people a bunch of stacks of blocks like this and ask you to judge, let's say on a scale of 1 to 7, which ones are relatively stable under gravity and which ones are likely to fall. And these are roughly ordered according to what people perceive as their instability. So this one looks like it's basically stable under gravity. These ones down here look like they're about to fall. And we can make this quantitative by getting you to judge, or a group of people to judge on a scale of 1 to 7, and then averaging them. And we can make lots of graphs like this, where along the y-axis here, we're plotting the average judgment of a group of people like you, and along the x-axis, we're plotting the judgment of one of our probabilistic programs. And these are graded numbers, probabilities between 0 and 1, that are just, again, making a good guess about what's likely to happen with an approximation of Newtonian mechanics. Now, I could show you experiments all day like this, but I just want to show you one or two more that emphasizes, again, how we're getting at the hallmark of common sense that was there motivating the earliest symbolic approaches to intelligence, this flexibility. There's so many questions that we could ask and answer just about a scene like this. I'll just show you one to maybe put the flexibility in the most dramatic sense. So here's a table with a set of blocks, red and yellow blocks. And imagine now, I'm not just asking you what will happen under gravity, but suppose I bump the table hard enough to knock some of them onto the floor. What do you think is likely to be on the floor, red or yellow blocks in this case? Good, red. How about here? Okay, here? Yep, here? Yep, here? Yep. Good. Here? Okay, you get the idea. I could literally go on forever. I've generated just a few of these pictures. How can you look at any one of these things and just like in a snap like that, figure out what's likely to happen? Well, this is a glimpse inside our program. We think you're doing something like this. You're running an actual simulation. This is a simulation of a small bump. And what you see is mostly yellow ones coming over. And here's a simulation of a big bump. Again, mostly yellow ones. And you just have to do a few simulations like that, and you can make a pretty good guess. That's what we think is going on inside your brain. And we can test that quantitatively by just varying all these different stimulus conditions. I won't really go into the details of the design, but again, it does a pretty good job of describing your graded intuitions about stability. We can just keep pushing this by, say, making the objects have different shapes, attaching various walls to constrain the geometry of the table. We can tell you the direction of the bump, and it just keeps going. We can use this knowledge for studying how humans, including even young children, plan actions. Like, how might you build these different configurations if you want them to be stable? You might have to attach some glue or nails, like in that scene I showed you before. And we can ask, what's the minimal way you need to attach these things in order to make this a stable configuration? The very same knowledge can be used for that. And just to bring this back to the intuitive psychology problem, just to show you how it's not just about physical reasoning, right? Here, again, as I mentioned, the programs now are not just physics programs, but these intentional planning programs that have been developed by roboticists, where you imagine an agent who has some unobservable beliefs about the world, what's where, some goals, and you assume that they're like the robots that we're trying to build in AI, they're trying to move around in the world to try to achieve their goals as effectively, as efficiently as possible, given their beliefs. And if you treat other people that way and make guesses about what their beliefs and desires might be from their actions, you can understand what they're thinking and what they want. I'll just give you one window into an experiment that we've done testing this, just to see how this gets to be a little bit interesting. So here's a little toy world. We call this the food truck experiment. At MIT, if you remember, it was probably like this. It's been like this for some years now. Hungry students often go to get their lunch not from MIT Food Services, secret, but from the food trucks that are parked all around campus, which provide a range of tasty options. And in this little glimpse of campus here, there's 2 parking spots for food trucks, shown in yellow, and there happen to be 3 trucks in this world. Korean truck, the K, a Lebanese truck, the L, and a Mexican truck. And on different days, different trucks come and park in different places. On this day, the Korean truck parked here, the Lebanese truck parked there, and the Mexican truck didn't make it in today. So it's not here. And now imagine a student who goes out looking for his lunch, and he leaves his dorm room over here, and he can see, only in sort of his line of sight, he can see that the Korean truck is parked here. He doesn't know what's on the other side of the building, so he walks around to the other side, where now he can see the Lebanese truck, and he goes back to the Korean truck. And the question for you is, which is his favorite truck? Korean, Lebanese, or Mexican? What do you say? Yeah. Mexican, yes. Thanks for somebody saying something I can hear. Yeah, Mexican. Isn't that interesting, right? And what's his second favorite? Korean, right. So that's the easy one, because that's the one he winds up with. But isn't it interesting that your guess about what his favorite one is one that isn't even present there, right? It's not that hard to build a computer to detect when somebody's reaching for something, like when I'm reaching for this cup of water, you see my hand going towards it. But it's a little bit interesting to detect that what you're looking for, what you want, is something that isn't even present in the scene. Yet that's the kind of reasoning you do, again, just like that. And you do that by making the inference that not only did he, as this bars show, prefer the Mexican truck, but also that he had a belief that the Mexican truck was probably there, which is why it was worth going to look for it. And people make this sort of joint judgment about both what he wants and what he believes is there. And we can take these same kinds of models and scale them up in all sorts of ways. One of the most exciting things that's going on from our perspective at MIT right now is a bunch of integrative intelligence projects which are putting together the kind of stuff that I'm talking about here with what many other faculty and students are working on. We've gotten some exciting funding from this from a range of private and public sources, like the Simons Foundation with the Center for the Social Brain. Google has launched a Rethinking AI project here, which is mostly about AI, but really focused on more human-like AI systems. NSF has preliminarily approved a very exciting new Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, which cuts across all the different parts of MIT of people who are interested in this. And we're taking these kinds of models that I've talked about here, we're trying to put them into more human-like robots, we're trying to understand a range of human social interactions, both adults and children, and we're trying to understand how this works in the brain at multiple levels of analysis, including the large-scale brain areas, down to the level of circuits and individual neurons, all the levels that Jim talked about. We think we're on the verge of being able to connect all these pieces with the kind of models and experimental techniques that you've started to see here and that you'll see over the rest of this session. So just to sum up then, we're trying to get at a question that's been with us for hundreds and in some form thousands of years. What is the computational basis of common sense? And we think that it's something to do with our understanding of physical objects, intentional agents, and their interactions. And we think we're finally being able to begin to address questions of what this knowledge is like, how it works, where it comes from, how it's implemented in the brain. And one part of the picture is what I've told you here, this idea that the brain isn't just a symbolic logic engine or a statistical learning engine, but an engine for simulating the world. And this, combined with a lot of other techniques and tools that you're going to hear about, is making this a very exciting time to understand what thought is and how it works in the brain and the mind. Thank you.